Hi, Mr. O'Toole. Pleasure to welcome you back to our program.
It's great to be with you in the foyer of the Commons.
Yeah, nice to be back.
It
Congratulations on your election as well. I've heard you comment in the past few weeks that you think the Liberals got pandemic aid all wrong. CERB is about to end for millions of Canadians. The Liberals plan on transitioning many of them to EI and then setting up a separate benefit for people who don't qualify for EI. Do you agree with that approach, and will you support it?
I've been calling on the expansion of EI for months, actually, when the Liberals were still not responding to COVID. I was saying we needed to use the EI system, expand it to self-employed, a number of people that wouldn't have qualified under the EI. We're going to have everyone's back coming out of the first wave of the pandemic. But where I was upset is they didn't preserve the number of jobs we needed to because the wage subsidy was rolled out improperly. Even the rent subsidy, which they extended today, very few qualified because it was slow, rules didn't apply, and a lot of landlords set up different arrangements. So we've got to get the response better.
When you talk about the wage subsidy, for example, I've also heard you say that should have come before the CERB. How would that have worked?
Well, what happened is, my prediction is the government had 2 to 3 times more Canadians on the CERB than they anticipated. I think their original estimate was they would only spend about $24 billion on the CERB. It ended up being probably $100 billion. Why? Because employers weren't certain there was going to be a wage subsidy in the 75% range. In fact, I was here when they first introduced the bill saying the wage subsidy would only be 10%. My approach was, let's put as many jobs in hibernation as possible so that they're there for full employment or as close to coming out of the first wave. That's what they got wrong out of the gate. I wasn't just the back seat driver here. I spoke to several ministers personally. I've suspended my own personal campaign to put the country first. So I think we have to learn about what they did wrong, but let Canadians know we're going to have everyone's back as we emerge from the toughest challenge we've faced in my lifetime.
Do you really think it was the wage subsidy percentage? Because they did change that relatively quickly. Was it more that employers were very unsure about when or how they would be able to reopen? So they were hesitant to go on the wage subsidy for a while. And I guess my question is more about CERB, right? Like, are you trying to say that Canadians went on CERB when they didn't really need to? Because I think there are millions of Canadians who would put it differently.
Employers who didn't think the government was going to have a serious wage subsidy program let people go because they knew the CERB was there, they weren't sure about their own future, and they had no confidence in the Trudeau government. In fact, when you had an emergency bill that at first they tried to sneak in extraordinary powers to have no parliamentary oversight for over a year, employers were very unsure whether there would be enough support to preserve those jobs for 3 months or so. That's where they got it wrong, and I think the result was more employers shed jobs. That's going to be more of a challenge to relaunch the economy. So, as I said, the Conservatives tried throughout the pandemic to propose better solutions, to work with the government, to approve the emergency bills, but we have to learn the Trudeau government was slow to respond, a month and a half slow on the border, and slow to respond to save jobs, and we're going to pay the price as a result of that.
So just to be clear, though, when they go ahead, for example, and bring in legislation, let's say all things work out when the House resumes, to create this new benefit for people who don't qualify for EI but still need CERB, you will support that?
We are going to look at ways of improving it. In fact, some of the enhancements to overcome some of the shortcomings of EI were ones I proposed in March. So if there's finally listening to some of the proposals we've been making for months, we will support that. But let me be perfectly clear. I'm not going to let Justin Trudeau avoid responsibility for the WE scandal, for his own personal ethics, to rush some fake election that he's trying to hide from his own record. We'll work with them if it's for the benefit of Canadian families, Canadian employers, small businesses. We will also critique and hold them to account.
I'm not really sure I'm clear, though, on whether that means you will support continued benefits for people who need the CERB. And I'll tell you what I'm asking.
We're going to have everyone's back.
But I want you to be specific, because the accusation from the Conservatives' critics is that, you know, the idea is being put out there that people are on CERB who don't need to be, right? They're relying on it when they should be going back to work. Is that a theory that you prescribe to, or will you, if people say they need CERB, support the government in making some form of it available?
Absolutely. We're going to make sure that there's support for people as the economy transitions. The more important thing is there going to be an economy to transition to. The Liberals have been against manufacturing, against energy. They don't have a softwood lumber agreement. They've mishandled steel, aluminum. There's a lot of lack of confidence in the private sector in Canada right now because of the Trudeau government. So we have to work on that at the same time because we need people working, we need the economy to be growing to make sure we can bounce back as effectively and as quickly as possible after the pandemic.
So you put out a video this weekend to that effect, talking about what you term a Canada First economic policy. Is that different than what Donald Trump says is America First?
No, it's not different at all. In fact, there's more self-sufficiency. I know Premier Ford and Premier Legault are meeting today. They've both come up with Made in Ontario, Made in Quebec programs I've been talking about for months. More self-sufficiency in PPE, more ability to have food security, energy security. In some cases, it'll be working with partners like the United States, democratic partners. In some cases, it means pulling back manufacturing from China and other countries that we can't trust for supply in the midst of a second wave of the pandemic, for example. So we have to learn the lessons. We have to put Canadian working families first. I'm going to do that from trade to our own domestic economic response post-COVID. And as I said, we're going to hold the government to account where they fall short.
Do you think then that Donald Trump has been right to pursue a policy of America First, which you know has had incredibly negative effects on our own economy and the relationship that we have with the United States?
Well, under the Trudeau government, our failing results with the U.S. started under President Obama, actually. It was with the cancellation of Keystone XL, changes to border, giving them entry and exit visa information for nothing in return. We've had bad results on trade in the NAFTA negotiations, on steel and aluminum tariffs. I think we need a far more serious approach. And some of it relates to the Trump administration, but a lot of it predates that because Mr. Trudeau didn't take the U.S. relationship seriously.
My question, though, was do you think Donald Trump was right to pursue such a nationalistic economic agenda? And do you think that there are perhaps unintended consequences of pursuing one here as well?
No, I'm going to be standing up for our industries and getting better deals. I'm more of a free trader than what we see in the United States right now. We see some protectionism, and we really see a couple of large corporate interests being advanced that actually hurts a lot of middle-sized employers in both the United States and Canada. So I don't agree with some of the moves being made in the United States. I do agree with some of the concerns about China. The tariffing of Chinese overdumped steel, for example, started under the Obama administration. It was taken to another level under President Trump. I think we should have been working on global trade with countries like Australia, the United States, the UK in a much smarter way than we were under Mr. Trudeau.
You talk a lot about bad free trade deals in that video, throughout your campaign. In particular, you focused on China from a foreign policy perspective, but also an economic perspective, including some of what you just said. Do you think that the deal that your previous government, under then Prime Minister Stephen Harper, signed with China back in 2012, it came into effect in 2014, FIPA as it's known, was a bad one?
No, that was about protection of Canadian exporters. And this is important for Canadians to understand because most of Twitter doesn't understand it. A Chinese company, whether it's Huawei, which Mr. Trudeau still hasn't said won't be part of our 5G critical infrastructure, they can use our court system. If there's ever a commercial dispute or they have a contractual fight, they've got the best, most transparent court system in the world. Our exporters to China, just ask the canola growers what happens when China decides not to follow the rules. The protection agreement was meant to protect some of our exporters, give them more certainty.
But it doesn't.
In some cases, the regime, as we've seen in Beijing, does not follow trade norms, does not follow rules.
Shouldn't the leader of your party back then have known that?
No, this was about giving more protection. And I'll tell you, in 2017, when Beijing doubled down through the People's Congress on the role of the Communist Party in state-owned enterprises, on them being an arm of the Chinese state, the Communist Party, the situation with China in the last 5 years has gotten a lot more serious. And I think we can't really trust the certainty that the protection agreement, the FIPA, was meant to provide. So we have to be eyes wide open with China, is what I've said, not the sort of admiration for China that Mr. Trudeau expressed at the beginning of his time. If I'm Prime Minister, we will have a serious, mature, and approach with China that I think shows our concerns with them on the global stage.
I think a lot of people who pay attention to China, and in particular some of the human rights atrocities committed there, would argue that it's not new, that it didn't just happen over the last 5 years. You have placed all the blame for kind of ignoring that and pursuing any kind of trade with China in the Prime Minister's lap. And I guess respectfully, my question to you is that fair? Is it hypocritical? Because in essence, Prime Minister Harper was also turning a blind eye at that point, and so was your government.
That's not correct, Vashi. We, in fact, gave honorary citizenship to the Dalai Lama. We stood up on the world stage for certain cybersecurity and other concerns that the Five Eyes, our closest allies, had with China. I put it on Prime Minister Trudeau's lap because the first country he said he admired when he was running to be Prime Minister was China. The chair of his transition team into government in 2015 was the head of the Canada-China Business Council. They stated an objective was to have a free trade agreement with a communist country like China that was already by that point not following international trade rules with respect to commodities.
With respect, though, the Conservatives also let in a state-owned company to the oil patch, right? With the Nexen deal, it was the Conservatives who approved that.
I think when it comes to IP and technology that's critical for our security, we were always very careful with that. But I think we even learned that critical natural resource assets are probably something we shouldn't have in the hands of a foreign interest like that. But I will tell you, one of the security deals we turned down in the final year of the Harper government, Mr. Trudeau reversed within 1 year, much to the argument against by security experts here. And in the United States, they viewed Canada, under Mr. Trudeau, as one of the weak Five Eyes members in a group that's about security and intelligence. So I think we have to show a much more serious approach. I do place a lot of blame on Mr. Trudeau because he made his UN Security Council bid seat his priority and a free trade agreement with China. How have both of those gone, Vashi? They've both been colossal failures.
Okay, I feel like I could ask a million more questions on that, and I think we've done many interviews about environmental policy, and I know that you specifically acknowledged it's something that your party needs to do better on in this election, particularly among the constituencies where you need to make some gains, let's say, to see more success. Beyond the carbon tax discussion, and I know that you reject it, I read through your platform, and I know that it does talk about climate goals, and it says specifically, under my leadership, Canada will contribute meaningfully to lowering global GHG emissions. I just want to know unequivocally, does that mean that a government led by Erin O'Toole will adhere to the goals set by the Paris Agreement?
Yes, that will be our intention.
So you will...
In fact, the targets that the Trudeau government signed on to in Paris were targets that we had prepared at the tail end of the Conservative government. I'm committed to that through partnering with provinces, not an Ottawa knows best approach, as we've seen with the carbon tax. But you're right, I'm glad you're looking at our policy. I hope a lot of people do. We weren't solid enough on this issue in the last few years, and when we said to people we were against the carbon tax because it was unfair, it was uncompetitive, we had to say what we were for, and that's what I will do. The environment is important to me, not just as a parliamentarian and party leader, as a father and as someone that considers myself environmentally minded.
Your thesis, though, is basically, from what I gathered, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, technology, not carbon tax. I've tried...
In fact, my thesis is what Mr. Trudeau used to say before he became Prime Minister. He said the provinces should be in charge of making decisions with respect to carbon pricing.
So there should be no federal leadership?
They should be federal partnership. In fact, we have a confederation where the provinces, who's making the decisions about the opening of the economies? It's the provinces. It's an area of shared jurisdiction. In fact, a court of appeal in this country has already said Mr. Trudeau's approach on the carbon tax was unconstitutional. I agree. So BC has had a carbon tax provincially.
It is, but yes.
BC has had their approach for over a decade. I've spoke to the former premier who started their carbon tax. Quebec has a different approach. Premier Kenney and Premier Ford both work with large emitters to try and get emissions down. Wherever I can partner, let's do that. Through technology, through working with them, using the tax system in a positive way. I also think on the federal side, there's a lot we can do on transportation and other sectors that are large emission sectors. That will be my approach. People will see it's serious.
When you say it's your intention to meet the Paris climate goals, is that, Peter MacKay during the campaign said they're aspirational. Is that something different than aspirational?
No, when we sign an international accord, we have to do our, to sound like a lawyer now, best efforts to meet what we signed.
What happens if a government under Erin O'Toole doesn't?
We will then reflect and look and see how we can improve. There is no punishment for not making those agreements. When we sign these international accords, going back to to Mr. Mulrooney and Rio, there's a commitment to try and reduce emissions or reduce the use of CFCs through the Montreal Protocol, any of these environmental accords. We have to have a serious plan to get there. That's my intention. The Conservatives will have a serious plan that is not a tax on families and businesses, that will get our emissions down by partnering, by being strategic and taking it seriously, but not through just a tax mechanism.
Okay, I have a question for you. My colleague is coming up, Ashley Burke. She's reporting on repairs and maintenance that's going to be done at Stornoway, the residence that you're going to move into. And basically in the period between now and when that happens, the repairs amount to $170,000. Your office had to give them access and time to do that. Are you okay with that level of repairs?
I've asked the NCC that we want to move in our own kids' furniture. We don't want anything done. We want to get in so that we can show we are ready to form a government. I don't want any expense paid, but what the NCC does on their own, we are not in the house yet. But it's important for me as somebody who has young kids. We want them to have their rooms, the furniture made by their grandfather in Nova Scotia. That's going to be our approach. People will see that we know where they've come from because we're a middle-class family. We have an honor of serving in this role right now, but we're not asking for any work or repairs.
But are you okay with $170,000 being done? You know why I'm asking, because of the controversy around 24 Sussex. Obviously this is a smaller amount, but in the past you've said those repairs should only be done if Justin Trudeau pays back, if the Prime Minister pays back the costs of the Aga Khan trip. So you've associated
his first ethical scandal. I remember back then, and he's now on his third.
But you've associated it in a political fashion.
And if the NCC does something before we get in there, we want it to be minimal.
Have you communicated that to the NCC?
I haven't even been there yet because I've been rolling up my sleeves to get things done. We're going to show Canadians that we're a government in waiting. I'm a middle-class dad. I'd prefer to just stay status quo, but I'm committed to showing we're ready, and my kids and my family are important to me, but I want to be accountable to the taxpayer always.
It is the NCC also saying that those repairs are necessary for 24 Sussex, right? So,
the Prime Minister hasn't presented a plan. I'm looking forward to the plan wherever it comes.
But for you, this is apolitical, so you're not going to tell the NCC one way or the other.
We've already said we want minimal done, and we want to even do things like use our children's own furniture. We don't want anything special. We want to just get to work.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. I appreciate your time as always.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.